My name is Nora Camden. I am a second-year cadet at Redcliffe Leadership Academy, which sounds impressive until you know why I'm really here. My mum said she and her husband were sending me $1,200 a month to cover everything, but I haven't seen a cent. I woke up at 4:17, not because of an alarm or morning duty or anything structured like that. I just did. My body had learned its own rhythm inside this freezing box of a dorm room. It was still dark out Utah cold, the kind of dry winter air that slid through the cracks in the window pane like a whisper you couldn't unhear. I could feel it in my teeth. Redcliffe called itself a leadership academy, but that was a fancy way of saying we were cadets, with rules tighter than most military boarding schools. You showed up, you endured, or you left. No one begged you to stay. No one noticed if you left. I didn't come here to escape. At least not in the way people mean when they say that. I came here because I wanted structure. Or maybe just a place where people didn't pretend to love you and forget you in the same breath. My mother said I was always fine on my own. She said it like a compliment. She said it like a fact. The problem was she believed it so much that she stopped checking whether it was true. The room was still. My roommate was asleep, Brianna, a girl from Reno who snored like an old truck and still wrote letters to her grandma every Sunday. I sat up, felt the cold hit the back of my neck and reached for the notebook I kept under my pillow. 1 page per day, not a journal, just evidence that I was here, that I kept going. Money was always a quiet panic. When I enrolled, Mum said she and her husband, my stepdad Thomas, had arranged everything. Tuition, living expenses, a monthly stipend. $1,500 a month, she'd said, smiling like I should be grateful. That's more than fair. It sounded like a lot. It was a lot, but I never saw it. Not even once. Redcliffe didn't send warning emails to students if your parents were the ones making payments. The account looked settled every time I checked. But after the second month of buying instant noodles with change I found in the common room vending machine, I started to wonder. The first few months I gave Mum the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it was processing. Maybe it went into my school tab. But it never did. I'd ask, gently, carefully, never directly, because you learn not to confront people who make you feel like a burden for asking questions. She always had an answer. It's handled, sweetheart. Focus on your studies. So I did. I focused. I learned how to take notes without new notebooks. I sold the tablet my grandmother gave me for my birthday. I worked evening shifts in Redcliffe's equipment room, cleaning helmets and repacking survival kits, which was technically against cadet rules, but unofficial exceptions were made if you asked the right officer. That morning, for 417, my feet hit the cold tile and I didn't flinch. I was already awake. I was already braced, somewhere between the radiator hum and the scraping wind outside. I realized I didn't expect warmth anymore. Not from the room and not from anyone outside it. But before I share my story with you, I'd love to know you're here with me. Drop a simple hi in the comments so I know you're listening, or let me know where you're watching from. I love to see how far my story can reach. And if this story finds a place in your heart, please consider subscribing. It helps stories like mine get heard, stories of strength buried in silence. Thank you. So when my mother invited me to a wedding, family friends, she said, I didn't expect much either. It wasn't her style to include me in anything that required more than a polite nod or a seat at the end of the table. But this time she insisted. They haven't seen you since you were little. It'll be good for you to show your face, she said, like I was a product she hadn't taken off the shelf in a while. The wedding wasn't even for a close cousin. It was for the daughter of her college roommate, someone I couldn't remember meeting. The kind of event where everyone smiled too long and clinked glasses before remembering why they were celebrating. I wore the only dress shirt I owned that still fit buttoned to the top because that's how my grandmother always said a lady carried herself. Mum barely looked at me when I got into the car. Her eyes scanned her lipstick in the mirror as she said, "You should let your hair down. You always look so severe." The venue was a country club, manicured lawns and servers with practiced smiles. Inside, there were candles in jars and linen napkins that probably cost more than a week's worth of my groceries. Everyone looked like they belonged on the cover of a local lifestyle magazine. I stood near the drink table with a glass of water, nodding politely at strangers, who gave me the same look people give to distant relatives, whose names they've forgotten. "Oh, you must be Nora," one woman said. "Laurel's daughter, right? The one at that military place." I smiled the way you do when there's no way out but through. "Yes, Redcliffe." She blinked, nodded clearly, unsure if that was impressive or tragic. "That's very disciplined of you." I excused myself and found a quieter spot near the back patio, pretending to look at the view. The mountains were dim in the dusk, more shadow than shape. I could still hear my mother inside laughing. A big, social laugh she never used at home. A few minutes later, I felt her hand on my shoulder. "Don't disappear," she said. "People are asking about you." I turned, slightly just enough to make it clear I was listening. "What people?" She didn't answer. Instead, she guided me back toward the room like I was 10 years old and had wandered off at the mall. When we rejoined the circle of well-lit conversations and clinking silverware, she said it loud enough for everyone around to hear, "This is my daughter, Nora. She's the one at Redcliffe, so much like her father, quiet, strong-willed, doesn't ask for help." There it was, the classic line. She always used it when she wanted to paint herself as the parent of someone admirable without ever having to actually admire me in real life. "Just like her father," she repeated. "He would have been proud." I nodded, smiled, said nothing. My father died when I was 11. I remember because it was winter and I was wearing socks that didn't match because he used to do the laundry, and Mum hadn't figured out the system yet. He used to hum when he folded clothes. After he was gone, everything got quieter, but not softer. "She's very independent," Mum added. "Always has been. I never have to worry about her." People nodded, impressed. One woman said, "That's a gift." I wondered if anyone would clap if I disappeared entirely. After a while, I made another excuse to leave the circle. In the hallway outside the reception room, there was a mirror. I looked at myself and saw someone who had trained herself to blend in so well she almost vanished. My hair pulled back tight, my shoes scuffed, my face calm. Inside, I heard laughter. Someone popped champagne. Someone else cheered. I walked outside. The cold hit fast, but I didn't move. I just stood there holding my empty glass, like it still had something in it. I thought about the $1,500 a month they said was mine. Thought about the vending machine dinners, the notebook under my pillow, the gloves I'd lost in the snow during drills. Thought about the way Mum called me strong, when what she really meant was inconvenient. No one had asked me how I was doing, not once. Not that I expected them to, but a small part of me had hoped that maybe someone, just one person, would see past the pressed shirt and stiff smile and ask something real. It didn't happen. So I went back inside, took my seat, ate my meal, and watched my mother tell someone else that I'd never caused her a day of worry. She looked proud, and maybe she was, but not of me, of how well I'd made her look. It was always like that with her appearance first facts, second and feelings, somewhere at the bottom if they made the list at all. I used to think that maybe if I behaved like Caleb, I'd get the same grace he did, but I wasn't built for messes big enough to be excused. Caleb could make a disaster look like an accident, and people would nod understanding. I once told the truth about forgetting to call home after a 12-hour drill weekend, and Mum accused me of being disrespectful. It's not that hard to send a text, she'd said. But when Caleb didn't show up to my birthday dinner 3 years in a row, she blamed traffic. He lived 20 minutes away. He always had the better excuses. or maybe just the better delivery. Smooth, casual, like the lies didn't taste like ash in his mouth. He once told Mom he was checking into a detox program, said he needed to get clean center himself, maybe reconnect with God. She wired him $800. 2 days later, he got pulled over in Arizona driving 90 in a rented Mustang with an open bottle on the passenger seat. He spent the night in a holding cell. She called it a misunderstanding. She said the stress of being judged probably pushed him to act out. He's just not like you, Nora. He feels things harder. I remember her exact words. Like my silence wasn't a form of feeling. Like my steadiness didn't cost me anything. Even when Caleb missed holidays or pawned family heirlooms, he still got invited back in. He'd show up with a grin and some half-hearted apology, and Mum would make his favourite lasagna, like it was a celebration. "We're just glad you're here," she'd say, setting the table. When I came home once after finals with a B in chemistry, she didn't say a word, just left the report card on the counter and circled the grade in red pen. She didn't yell, she didn't need to. She had a way of making silence into punishment. I remember one Thanksgiving when Caleb hadn't shown up until dessert. He walked in wearing sunglasses reeking of cologne and something sharper underneath. I was 14, and I asked if he was okay. Mum turned to me with that smile she used when she was pretending to be calm. "Don't be dramatic, Nora. He's fine. You're too sensitive." That line stuck. Too sensitive. She used it on me and on my grandmother too, especially when we noticed something she didn't want to explain. Bar Margot once mailed me a letter with a check tucked inside just $20. She told me to get something warm and impractical. When I thanked her over the phone, she seemed surprised. "I thought your mother said you weren't feeling well," she said. "Said you didn't want visitors." I hadn't said that. I'd wanted to go to her house that weekend, but Mum told me we had other plans. It wasn't just the lies, it was how effortlessly they were told on my behalf. I started to feel like I didn't even belong to myself. When Caleb got into trouble, Mum went into fix-it mode. Phone calls, favours, payments she couldn't afford, but made anyway. When I needed a ride to a campus interview, she said, "Can't you take the bus?" She always said it like it was about building my independence, but only when it was convenient. I once asked her why she never held Caleb accountable, why she forgave him so easily. She looked at me, genuinely confused, and said, "Because he needs it," like I didn't. That line sat in my chest for months. It explained everything, didn't it? Caleb needed more, so he got more. I needed less, so I got nothing. The world didn't reward quiet endurance. It didn't hand out medals for managing your own pain. It barely noticed. At Redcliffe, I stopped mentioning Caleb altogether. No one knew I had a brother. I let them think I was an only child. It was easier than explaining how a person could take up so much space in a family without ever being responsible for what they did with it. Back home, Mum still framed him as trying. In every story she told about our family, he was the one who was learning, struggling, searching. I was just solid. I used to think being the reliable one meant I mattered. But now I realised it just meant I was invisible until someone needed me. One night while reorganising my locker, I found a scrap of paper I didn't remember keeping. It was a receipt from that time Caleb asked me to spot him for gas. He never paid me back. But I'd kept the receipt anyway, as if proof made it easier to accept the pattern. I crumpled it and threw it away. That was the first time I let myself admit it. Caleb was never going to change, and Mum was never going to stop covering for him. But I could stop covering for them both. It started small. I began logging into the Redcliffe student portal every Monday morning, checking the billing statements like they might change overnight. They never did. Every quarter, the system showed paid in full under my tuition and housing. The name on the payer account was Family Custodial, and the email contact listed was my mother's. There was no breakdown, no receipt, no way to see the source of funds. Just a green check mark. It looked official, final, done. But my life didn't match that little green box. I was down to one pair of winter socks, both thinning at the heels. My gloves were mismatched, one black, one navy. I wore the same base layers 3 days a week and washed them by hand in the dorm sink at night. Every trip to the commissary was a calculated math problem. Protein bars or printer paper, cough drops or shampoo. I told myself it was part of being independent, that I didn't come to Redcliffe for comfort. I came to prove I could carry my own weight, but the weight kept shifting, and I started to notice it was only heavy on my side. The questions had been quiet in my head for months, but they got louder after winter break. That's when I finally asked my stepdad. I caught him after dinner one evening while Mum was busy showing old vacation photos to a guest. I kept my tone casual, neutral. Hey, I was just curious. How does the school payment stuff work? Does Redcliffe send you invoices, or is it automatic? He looked surprised. Your mum handles all that, he said, sipping his wine. I just transfer the amount to her account every 3 months. I nodded. How much do you send? He didn't hesitate. 1,200. Every quarter. It took effort to keep my face still. I nodded again. And she gives some of that to me, right? For books, meals, stuff like that. He paused, tilting his head. She told me you didn't need it. Said you wanted to build budgeting skills. That you asked her not to hand you cash because it was a distraction. I laughed. It came out dry. She said that he smiled like it was funny, like it made me sound virtuous. She said you were trying to be disciplined, that you didn't want to spend money on unnecessary things. That was the word, unnecessary. As if gloves in a Utah winter were a luxury. As if the hunger headaches that woke me at 2 a.m. were optional. As if I was playing poverty, not living in it. I didn't correct him. I just said thanks and excused myself. Back in my room that night, I made a list of everything I'd gone without that year. Not in a dramatic way. Just facts. I listed the weeks I skipped dinner, the times I borrowed tampons from Brianna, the nights I studied by hallway light because my desk lamp broke and I couldn't afford a new bulb. Then, on the other side of the paper, I wrote $1, $200 every quarter. 4 quarters, 4,800s. I stared at the number like it might confess something. I didn't confront Mum. Not yet. I wanted proof, something harder than suspicion. So I went to the campus bursar's office, asked if I could get a payment history. The woman behind the counter smiled politely and said, "Sorry, we can't release that unless you're listed as the financial administrator." I wasn't. My name wasn't anywhere on the account. But it's my tuition, I said. She nodded sympathetically. It's still considered private unless your guardian authorises access. I walked out with my fists clenched in my pockets. That night, I opened an email draft, addressed it to Mum. I wrote, "Can you please send me a breakdown of how the school payments work? I'm trying to build a better budget." Then I deleted it. She would spin it. She always did. Instead, I wrote to my grandmother. Short and direct. Do you know how much money Mom receives for my schooling? Do you know if she's supposed to give any of it to me? The next morning, I had a voicemail. It was Bar Margot. Her voice cracked through the static. "I don't have full details, honey, but I'll find out. You shouldn't be cold. That's all I know. You shouldn't be hungry." It was the first time someone said that out loud, and maybe that was what made me finally stop pretending I was fine. Not in a dramatic way. Not with tears or raised voices. Just in the small decisions I started to make. Like the night I saw a flyer tacked to the bulletin board outside Redcliffe's admin wing. Equipment room shift. Openings. Cadets only. Max 9 hours classroom week. I signed up on the spot. The shifts were from 7 to 10 p.m, 3 nights a week. After classes, drills and dinner, I'd head to the back building near the track field, where the gear was stored, helmets, ropes, protective pads, winter uniforms. It smelled like sweat and rubber and the kind of plastic that always feels a little damp. I wiped everything down, repacked kits, and relabeled bins. The work wasn't hard, just tedious, but it came with a stipend, $6.50 an hour, direct to my campus card. No cash withdrawals allowed, but you could use it in the commissary and second-hand gear shop. That's where I saw them shoved into a clearance bin next to used shin guards and old field manuals. A pair of boots, real ones, sturdy, tread still, decent. One size too big, but nothing a second pair of socks couldn't fix. The tag read, returned. Cadet transfer, $22. I held them like they might vanish. My current shoes, originally gym sneakers, had soles that whispered every time I walked. The left one peeled slightly at the toe. I kept a rubber band looped around it during drills so it wouldn't flap. These boots felt like armor. I didn't have $22 yet. I had $14.75 on my campus card and $1.60 in coins from the laundry room. So I folded the boots back into the bin and left them there. Every shift after that, I checked. Still there, still waiting. By the end of the second week, I had enough. I bought them quietly. No celebration. Just slipped them into my duffel and carried them back to my dorm like something sacred. That night, I cleaned them with an old toothbrush and a towel soaked in hot water. Not to make them look new, just to make them mine. I threaded the laces slowly, tightly looping them twice around the ankle and tying them with the kind of knot my dad taught me when I was 7. The kind that held even in rain. The next morning, I wore them to formation. Every step made a soft rubber scuff on the concrete, but it was even solid. No flapping, no slide. I could feel the difference in my calves, more support, more weight. It made me walk straighter. Like I took up just a little more space. Brianna noticed first. New boots, she asked, sipping her terrible coffee. I shrugged. Sort of. I didn't tell her they were used. I didn't tell her I'd wiped someone else's sweat off the insoles. I didn't want pity. I wasn't proud, but I wasn't ashamed either. Every time I tightened the laces, I felt like I was putting on something closer to dignity. Not because they were expensive, or knew they weren't, but because I'd earned them. Every hour of wiping down helmets, every blister from hauling gear bins, every moment I stayed up later than I should just to scrape together enough to stand a little firmer on my own 2 feet. Some cadets made fun of the gear room shifts. Cleaning up other people's dirt, they'd scoff. I didn't care. I didn't need them to understand. I needed to know when I walked into a drill or sat in a classroom or stood in line for chow that I hadn't taken a shortcut. That even if nothing I wore was new, every single thing I had came from something I did. One night, I noticed a small tear on the back heel seam of the left boot. I stitched it up with black thread and dental floss, then reinforced it with duct tape from the supply closet. I didn't see it as broken. I saw it as prepared. Later that week, during cold weather training, we had to sprint uphill through packed snow. Halfway up, my old self would have slipped. The new boots held. When the instructor barked, "Keep your line," I didn't waver. At the top of the hill, I looked back. Someone else had fallen. I offered my hand. They took it. It wasn't pride, exactly, but it was something close. And for once, it was mine. A few days later, I found a padded envelope in my mailbox. No return address, just my name written in careful block letters that slanted slightly left. Inside was a cassette tape and a note that read, "Couldn't grip a pen this week. Play this instead. Love, Bar." I stared at the tape for a full minute before realizing I didn't own anything that could play it. No one under 30 did. But Redcliffe's Media Lab kept a box of old recorders for archival projects. I signed one out under the pretense of doing a research project for ethics class and walked it back to my room like it was something sacred. That night, after lights out, I wrapped my blanket around the recorder, pressed the headphones tight against my ears and hit play. The first sound was the click of her pressing record, followed by her breath, shaky, deliberate. Then, her voice. "Hi, sweetheart. It's your grandmother. I know you knew that, but I like saying it. Sometimes I need to remind myself I get to be that to someone." There was a pause, like she was gathering her next thought. "I couldn't hold a pen long enough this week. The arthritis is getting loud again, so I'm borrowing my voice, hoping it still means something." Another pause. "I sent a little money your way a few weeks back, $600. Told your mama to give it to you for a winter coat and gloves. Said it was early Christmas. Have you been warm, baby?" My throat tightened. I'd never seen that money. Not a cent. I was still wearing the same patched-up layers and hand-me-down thermals I'd worn since October. She said you'd bought something already, that maybe you didn't need it. I wasn't sure if I should believe her, but I didn't want to make things worse. Your mama said if I kept second-guessing her, you'd feel caught in the middle, and I didn't want that. But now I'm wondering if I should have pushed harder. Her voice dipped lower. "Sometimes I think you and I are the only ones who know what silence really costs. Not the kind where no one talks, anyone can live with that. I mean the kind where you choose not to ask anymore, because the answer always hurts more than the question." She coughed, then chuckled lightly, like she was trying to soften what came next. "When I was your age, I stopped asking too. My mama used to say, 'Don't poke the sleeping dog.' That meant don't stir up trouble. But trouble has a way of growing teeth when you don't look it in the eye." The tape hissed for a few seconds, then her voice returned. "I know you're strong. You always were. Even when you were little, you held your spoon like a soldier. But strong doesn't mean you shouldn't be held. It doesn't mean you're wrong to want more than getting by." I closed my eyes, letting her voice fill the small, cold space around me. I don't know if this tape will help anything she said. Maybe it just helps me. To say it. To say I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like you had to be smaller, just to fit into this family's idea of love. You don't. You hear me. You don't. There was a click. The tape ended. I sat there in the dark, headphones still pressing against my ears, like maybe her voice would echo again. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was angry. That came later. I just felt known. For the first time in a long time, someone had spoken to the part of me I'd buried the deepest, the part that still wished things could be different. That still wondered if I was being too sensitive, too dramatic, too hard to love. The next morning, I walked back to the media lab, returned the recorder, and checked out a second blank tape. I didn't know what I was going to say yet, but I knew I'd send something back. A thank you, a memory, maybe just silence, but something. Before I left the building, I asked the student tech if he could help me digitize the message. Just a backup, I said. He smiled, plugged the tape into an old deck, and started transferring. Want me to name the file something specific? He asked. I paused. Then said, call it Things That Were Meant For Me. It played in my head the next morning as I laced up my boots tighter than usual and stepped outside into the sharp Utah air. The sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of blue that made the wind seem louder. That morning was obstacle course day, mid-term fitness evaluation. Not the friendly kind with cheerleaders and medals. Redcliffe didn't do rewards, just metrics, numbers. Either you passed or you didn't. There were no retakes. We lined up at the edge of the field. Mud had iced over in places, forming patches slick as glass. Instructors barked instructions, but I already knew the course by heart. Tire run, rope climb, balance, beam, wall vault, crawl, tunnel, 400-meter sprint. It didn't matter how you looked doing it, just that you got through. No one cared if your hands bled or if your lungs gave out halfway. You crossed the finish or you didn't. I adjusted my gloves, the right one already thinning at the fingertips, and kept my eyes forward. On the first stretch, someone fell during the tire run. A chain reaction started cadets stumbling like dominoes. I hopped wide, barely keeping balance, and pressed on. The rope climb shredded my palms. I could feel the skin split, a sharp wetness spreading under my glove. But I didn't stop. Just gripped tighter, climbed faster. By the balance beam, my arms were shaking. Not from fatigue, but from cold and the adrenaline that came with knowing no one would stop the clock for you. The wall vault was brutal. Ice on the top edge made it feel like grabbing a blade. I hoisted myself over left knee, catching hard against the corner. For a second, I thought I'd slip. But I didn't. I landed, hard legs jarring like stone on stone, and kept running. The final sprint was where most cadets slowed. Not because they couldn't run, but because their bodies started second-guessing the pain. Mine didn't. My body, for once, obeyed. My chest burned. Blood from my palms soaked through my gloves. My throat tasted like iron. But I passed 3 people in the last 100 meters, crossed the line a full 8 seconds under the required time, then dropped to my knees, breathing like I was drowning in air. Nobody clapped. An instructor glanced at his stopwatch and said, "Met the mark. That was it. No praise, no good job, just confirmation that I wasn't a liability." But to me, it was more than enough. It was the first time in years I felt like my body had stayed with me, like it hadn't betrayed me by getting sick or tired or worn down. It didn't ask for help or hesitate or wait for someone to step in. It just moved, held me up, pushed me forward. I sat in the dirt for a while, hands on my knees, forehead resting on my sleeves. The blood was already crusting under my nails. The wind cut against my neck sharp and clean. Then I saw Dev walking toward me. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking down with his usual half-annoyed, half-neutral expression. Then he crouched next to me, reached into the side pocket of his jacket, and held out a wrapped piece of something small and square. "Salt candy," he said. "You're pale." I took it without speaking. He stood back up, brushing his knees. "If you pass out, I have to file a report. And I hate paperwork." I smirked, the wrapper crinkling in my palm. "Noted." He started to walk away, then paused. "You did okay." It was the closest thing to a compliment I'd ever heard from him. I stayed there another minute, letting the candy dissolve slowly. It was bitter, then sweet, then gone. Back in the dorm, I peeled off my gloves. The fabric stuck to my skin where it had bled through. I ran my hands under warm water, watching the red swirl down the drain like something being released. My palms looked raw, like I'd tried to grip the world too tightly. That night, I didn't write in my notebook. I didn't need to. My body had already done the telling. A few days later, I was back in a place I didn't belong, another wedding. Another excuse for relatives to wear clothes that didn't fit and pretend we all knew each other. It was the son of one of my mum's high school friends. I barely remembered him. We'd maybe shared a sandbox once. Still, I showed up because my mother insisted. She said it would look good if I came. "You're in uniform, kind of," she'd said. "People like that." I wore the boots, I bought myself the jacket I'd patched at the elbows, and a dress under it that used to be hers. No one noticed, or if they did, they didn't say anything. At events like these, no one asked questions that didn't have safe answers. Dinner was slow and full of small talk. I sat between 2 cousins I hadn't seen since elementary school. They mostly talked to each other. Across the table, my mum laughed too loud at something her friend said. She had that air about her, the one she wore like perfume. Proud, performed. Then, somewhere between the dry roast chicken and the first round of champagne, my stepfather turned to me. He had that soft smile on the one people use when they think they're saying something generous. "You're still managing okay with the 1,500 we send for school, right?" It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even the main conversation. It was a toss-away line. But everything else stopped. I looked at him. I've never seen that money, I said. It didn't come out angry, just even factual. There was a pause, a small one. My mother's wine glass clinked as she set it down a little too hard. That's not true, she said, her voice tight. We've been handling it. She doesn't always use it wisely, so I keep it until she needs something. She looked around the table like someone would back her up. No one did. My cousin glanced down at his plate. An uncle reached for the bread basket. Define wisely, I said. My voice was still calm, because I've been using duct tape to hold my gloves together. My mother narrowed her eyes. Don't be dramatic. I'm not, I said. I'm cold. Another pause. My stepfather blinked. But we've been sending it every month. To her, I said, not to me. Then my grandmother moved. Slowly, but deliberately, she pushed her chair back and stood. She leaned forward on her cane. I'd like to see the records, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. The whole table hushed. My mother's lips parted. Mum, this isn't the time. Grandma didn't blink. Then when is the time? Because we keep saying she's strong and responsible and capable, and maybe she is. But she shouldn't have to be all of that and cold. A long silence. Then Mum said quieter, I didn't think she'd need everything at once. You didn't think she'd need socks. Grandma's voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. You didn't think she'd need to eat without asking for it. Someone at the far end of the table whispered something. I didn't hear what. I was too busy trying not to let the shaking in my hands show. I sent $600 through you, Grandma continued, for a coat, for gloves, and you said it was handled. My mother's mouth tightened. I didn't lie. You withheld, Grandma said. You filtered. I looked down, not because I was ashamed, but because I felt seen in a way that left me unsteady. Mom finally said, we can talk about this at home. No, I said. We're not at home. And this is already real. My stepfather looked between us. I didn't know, he said quietly. I really didn't. Grandma reached for her purse. Then, let's find out now. Pull up the transaction records. Mum's face went pale. That's when I knew. That's when we all knew. I pulled out my phone and logged into the student portal. The screen showed paid in full, but no details. My grandmother cleared her throat. Your mother worked in administration at the district office, right? She knew how to create forms emails. She turned to me. Let's check your loan statements. Tuition, any equipment fee loans in your name. She reached for her cane and stood. You and I, let's go to the bank tomorrow. I want you to have complete control over your money. There was a tense shuffle. Mum said, You can't just look at everything now. It was never like that. Stepdad looked like he had something to say, but thought better of it. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts circled back to the equipment fee loan I had no memory of signing. I remembered buying used boots, selling my tablet, working my shifts. But a loan in my name. Without me knowing, the thought made sweat break on my forehead. The next morning, Grandma and I walked into a small branch of the credit union where my mum had co-signed my account. The teller greeted Grandma with a nod. She'd been banking there for 30 years. We asked for my account and loan history. The teller printed my statements while Grandma rubbed her fingers together to stop the tremor. When I saw it, my stomach dropped. A $1,200 loan taken out 8 months ago. Student equipment loan approved. No note from me, no initial payment. The interest was dripping in small monthly installments. My heart tightened. I checked out the loan application form signature line, included both names. Mum's name was typed next to guardian consent, but the signature under mine was hers. Not mine. I stared. Grandma looked away to hide tears. See, she said softly. They misused your name. Back home, I confronted Mum. She stared at the form on the kitchen counter, then at me standing across it. I filled it out for you, she said. You needed the gear. I thought I was doing the right thing, I asked. But why use my name? Why not yours? She avoided my eyes. They needed your name. They said it was part of the process. The school, the loan office, they needed your signature. But it's not mine. She raised her voice slightly for the first time. It's done. You got the gear. You had what you needed. My grandmother stepped in. You had what you needed, Mum, but not at her expense. She didn't sign it. Mum's shoulders slumped. She whispered, I did it because I thought I didn't want you to struggle. I felt anger rise, but kept my voice even. I don't need my name used without my consent. I don't need charity mislabeled as help. That afternoon, Grandma and I returned to the credit union. We opened a new checking account with my name, only no cosigner. Bank staff looked at me, asked me to sign all the forms. My grandmother squeezed my hand when I finished. The woman behind the desk smiled and said, All set. I nodded. We walked home in silence. Grandma spoke only once. You don't belong in someone's ledger unless you sign the line. That night, I packed my things and locked my room. I gathered the loan paper, the fake signature, the records. I slid them into a folder labelled mine. I opened my new account online, no balance yet, but my name stood alone. Mum quietly moved past while I did it. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I lay down on my bed and pulled the blanket over myself. I realised it was the first time I felt the space in the room belonged to me. I wasn't just a name or a figure labelled student loan. I was myself. And slowly I began to reclaim more. The first sign came during tactics training. Our instructor announced team captains for a simulated mission recon and extraction. I expected to be overlooked. I'd always flown under the radar. But when he said my name, something inside me shifted. I walked forward with my new notebook, one I actually bought myself, and the blue pen Dad left behind before he passed. It wrote in a deep colour that didn't smear, that didn't erase easily. It felt like permanence. We gathered in the dusty courtyard near the old hangar. My team was 5 strong, 2 juniors, a couple of newly enrolled freshmen and Dev. They glanced at me with respectful uncertainty. I stood tall. I explained my plan entry point through the east gate to avoid simulated hostile sentries, secure the asset extraction route on the south side, minimizing exposure fallback at checkpoint Bravo. I laid it out, clearly referencing past drills' timelines. Fallback signals. I wrote while they watched pen tracing lines and arrows and notes, every mark a claim to authority. I saw Dev nod when I spoke. That was the first real sign they were following me, because they believed I had a path forward. We moved through each exercise obstacle by obstacle. I called cadence-directed movement, adjusted plans on the fly when our simulated opposition shifted. When we finished, we were 2 minutes faster than the other teams. Nobody called me a girl who doesn't belong here. Instead, I heard "Good job, Camden." That was enough. Later, the instructor handed me a slip of paper. It read, Cadet. Camden exceeded expectations. Not clear when she shifted from follower to leader, but it happened. I held it tight in my hand. I walked back to my bunk and slipped it into my notebook, next to our tactical map tacked under the title I'd written in blue ink, Operation Self-Reliant. That night, I ate. I ate enough. I didn't let my stomach grumble through bedtime formation. I drank water, got 8 hours of sleep. My body relaxed. The soreness felt productive. My muscles felt like they remembered what they were for. Over the next week, I noticed I woke less often at 4:17. I didn't wake up cold. I woke up ready. I started doing morning PT on my own late sunrise jogs around campus. I ran past the flagpole, past the administration building, past the hills. I carried no pack, no mission, just my breath and the ground under me. I felt strong. In class, I spoke up. I asked questions. I volunteered for peer defense projects. I took notes in blue ink. When someone asked why not black, I smiled and said Dad's blue. They nodded, understanding on a different level. It was subtle, but people knew who I was. One evening, Mum sent me a text asking to call her. I saw the message but didn't reply. I walked outside to run instead. The cool air felt like forgiveness, not for her, but for me. For choosing me. At the end of the month, I went to the supply office and ordered the insulated jacket my grandmother paid for. I handed them cash from my new account. They handed it back, stamped issue to Cadet Camden. I wore it during formation the next morning. No one commented, but when the wind cut, I felt the fabric hold it back. Just like I was learning to. My body wasn't just surviving anymore, it was moving through space with intention. My mind was mapping possibilities. My voice had weight. One night, I wrote a letter, not in my notebook, but in a real envelope to Bar Margot I'm warm. I'm strong. I'm claimed. I signed it with the same blue ink and folded it neatly. I didn't hide anything. I was still Nora Camden, still a cadet. But now, and maybe for the first time, I belonged to myself. Then, she came. It was a Wednesday, cold and dry, just after midterms. I had just returned from the gym when I saw Dev standing outside my dorm room, arms crossed. "Your mum's here," he said, voice low. "At the front gate. She asked for you." I froze. How did she even get here? She didn't check in, just showed up. "She's been talking to admin for the last 10 minutes. They called me since your file has that no visitation clause. They wanted your decision." He paused. "You want to see her?" I shook my head. Dev nodded once and turned away. A few minutes later, I heard her voice shrill against the stillness of campus. "Nora, I came all this way, and you won't even look at me." Her voice wasn't desperate. It was irritated, like I'd left my shoes in the hallway again. "I raised you. I gave you everything I could. I stayed in my room. Campus had strict visitor policies. Every cadet filled out a preference form at the beginning of the year, whether or not to allow walk-ins and from whom. I'd checked no guests without approval and listed my mother specifically under restricted contact. I remembered the orientation officer raising an eyebrow but nodding. "You don't need a reason," she said. "Your space, your say." Now that rule was protecting me. But my body still shook. Not from fear. From the ache of old patterns trying to crawl back in. Through the window, I saw her pacing. Her coat too thin for the wind. Her heels too high for the gravel. She was trying to play the part of a mother, just trying to reconnect. The problem was, I no longer believed in her performance. She shouted again, "You're doing this out of spite. You're punishing me for things I didn't mean." Dev appeared next to her. He said nothing, just stood there. Present. Neutral. Then he waved to the guard on shift and the gate began to close. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there as the iron slid between us. That night, she sent me a long message. One of those voice memos she used to send when she was too angry to text. Her voice was softer now, but there was still the familiar sting. "You're pushing away the only people who care. You're living by hate, Nora." I didn't reply. Instead, I opened a new message and wrote to Bar Margot. "She came today." I didn't open the door. I don't know if that makes me a bad daughter, but it felt like the only honest thing I've done in years. Her response came the next morning. "Con Kong Bat Hu. Con Chi Jiang Bao Ve Fan Con Lai Kwa Min. You're not ungrateful. You're protecting what's left of you." Later that week, I ran into Dev again outside the mess hall. "She won't be back," he said, handing me a coffee. "She left right after." "No scene." I nodded. "Thanks for not pushing me to talk to her." Dev shrugged. "Didn't need to. You had a right to say no. You used it." I stood there a moment holding the warm paper cup, letting the quiet settle. Then I asked, "Would you have done the same?" He looked at me serious. "I don't know, but I'm glad you did." That night, I cleaned my locker. I found the photo of my family from years ago, me, Caleb, Mum and Dad, before he passed. I slid it into the back of my notebook behind all the new pages I'd written in blue ink. Not to erase the past, but to stop letting it write me. Then I laced up my boots and walked to the edge of campus, where the trail meets the woods. I didn't run. Not yet. I just stood there breathing, feeling what it was like to hold my ground. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel pride either. I felt free. At dawn the next morning, I laced my boots and filled my water bottle. I stepped outside into the clear hush that blankets Redcliffe before sunrise. No one called out my name. No one was waiting. That was precisely how I wanted it. The mountain trail wound upward, gravel crunching beneath my feet. My backpack was like nothing more than water, and a single photograph, tucked into a side pocket, Dad's smiling face taken the summer before he died. I didn't carry it to remember what I'd lost. I carried it to remind me why I chose this silence. To remind me if he could see me now, he'd understand. The air was cold, salty with pine. I started running. The rhythm of foot hitting earth warmed me. At first, the burn in my calves made me question if I was ready, but I pressed forward. I passed the flagpole where the morning formation would gather, but I didn't stop. I ran past the administration building where my mother might once have tracked these steps for performance. I ran past the dorms, knowing no one would peek out to ask where I was going. My breath came in, even lines, step, exhale, step, exhale. My heartbeat responded by steadying. I wasn't fleeing anything. I was pacing towards something I could finally belong to myself. I pulled the photo of Dad from my pocket and held it for a moment. Not to cry, not to grieve, but to feel the connection between the past I didn't choose and the present I owned. I whispered, "This is for you." He wasn't there, but I felt him in the wind, in the crispness of the air, in the strength of my own steps. The trail curved and climbed. My boots found purchase on roots and rocks, just as my mind found clarity with each ascent. I thought about the $600 she'd withheld, the signed loan she forged, the unspoken shame and the unearned forgiveness I refused. I thought about Bar Margot's voice coming through the tape, the first stranger who felt safe asking what my silence cost me back. I thought of the boots I earned caked in mud, each scrape a testament to sweat and no shortcuts. I paused halfway up where the trail overlooked the valley. The sky was turning pink with sunrise. I didn't stop running. I slowed, but kept a steady march. My lungs expanded with nothing but air. I kept the photo against my chest, running into the light. I wasn't chasing anyone. Not revenge, not forgiveness. I was charting the distance between who I'd been and who I was becoming. When I reached the top, I finally stopped. My chest heaved, my legs trembled, but I stood. I stood tall, boots planted on stone wind, tousling my hair. I looked down the valley mountains, flecked with morning light. I took a deep breath and pinned the photograph to the front of my pack, right where I could see it. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. The world wasn't silent, it was listening. The wind carried my presence forward, and for the first time I was moving into something that belonged to me. My voice came back with my next breath. I'm not running from anyone. I'm running toward who I should have been all along. With that step, I turned and jogged down the other side, unchained, whole, and moving forward. Maybe your story doesn't look exactly like mine. Maybe you didn't go to a military academy, or sell your tablet, or walk away from a parent you still wanted to believe in. But if you've ever been made to feel like needing something, made you weak, or like asking for clarity made you difficult, then you already know this story. You've lived some version of it. And here's what I've learned. Survival doesn't have to look like anger. Sometimes it looks like boundaries. Sometimes it looks like silence, that you choose not the kind forced on you. Sometimes it's a pair of worn boots, or a trail you run alone. or just knowing that you don't owe anyone an explanation for protecting your peace. A lot of us grew up thinking strength meant staying, that loyalty meant accepting less than what we deserved. But healing in real time often looks like walking away, not with hatred, but with clarity, and then walking towards something that finally feels like yours. If this story sat with you even for a moment, if it reminded you of your own strength or helped you name something you couldn't quite explain, I'd love for you to stay connected. Drop a hi in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Let me know which part made you pause. And if you think more people should hear stories like this, quiet stories, true stories, hit subscribe. It helps. And it reminds all of us that we're not as alone as we think. Thank you for being here. Truly. I see you. And I hope you find your way forward too.